Good evening. My name is Shivendra Singh, and on behalf of a suitable agency, I welcome you all to this magical evening at Suitable Conversations Under the Stars, a new evening edition of our much loved series, Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery. Over the past few years, we have gathered at this very beautiful space every winter to listen to some wonderful speakers, storytellers, and thinkers who have enthralled us at Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery. It is fitting that the new season of Suitable Conversations and the first Under the Stars edition begins this evening with a very special conversation on Urdunama featuring poet and translator Ranjit Hoskote and award-winning writer and translator Rakhshanda Jalil. As Gulzar Sahab has said, वो यार है जो खुशबू की तरह जिसकी ज़ुबान उर्दू की तरह है. A myriad voices of love, friendship, art, and culture have found their most indelible evocations in the Urdu language. And we are delighted to have two stalwarts of the language amongst us and a passionate audience that loves and makes Urdu. On to introductions then. Ranjit Hoskote is a highly acclaimed poet, cultural theorist, translator, and curator. His recent collections of poetry include Central Time, Hunchprose, Icelight, amongst others. His translation of an acclaimed 14th century Kashmiri woman mystic's poetry appeared as Lalla, and his translation of the great 18th century Urdu poet Mir Taqi Mir's poetry has been published as The Homelands and Ocean. He is also the author of a book of essays on the painter-poet Gieve Patel, To Break and to Branch. Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil is a multi-award winning translator, writer, and literary historian. She has published over 25 books and written over 50 academic papers and essays. Some of her books include Liking Progress, Loving Change, a literary history of the progressive writers movement in Urdu, a biography of Urdu feminist writer Dr. Rashid Jahan, A Rebel and a Cause, a translation of The Sea Lies Ahead, Intizar Hussein's seminal novel on Karachi, a collection of essays called Love in the Time of Hate, and translations of stories titled Whose Urdu Is It Anyway? Thank you, Ranjit and Rakhshanda, for joining us at the inaugural session of Suitable Conversations this season. The conversation will run for approximately an hour, followed by an audience Q&A session. The most recent books of both the writers are available here for sale, and the authors are here in case you wish to get them signed. Finally, I would like to thank our wonderful partner, Sunder Nursery, the most enchanting home that this series of conversations could have hoped for. That's it from me. Over to you, Ranjit and Rakhshanda. Thank you.
I think it's being in a place like this, at a time like this, that brings out so many associations and memories. And as I walked in, I thought to myself, Rakhshanda, that this is what Bagh-e-Bahisht means. It has to be a certain quality of enchantment surrounded by nature, and we are talking about things that matter to us as not only precious in an aesthetic sense, but urgent also in a political sense, and in terms of what matters to us and what may be taken from us. So maybe in that spirit, it might be an idea to begin with readings. Would you go for it?
Thank you, but wouldn't you rather do it? Wouldn't you? आप मेहमान हैं दिल्ली में.
After you. पहले आप.
Since we are both from Lucknow, it seems. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, Suitable Agency, the entire team, Himali, Ranjana, Ambar, everybody, Shivendra, and you, Ranjit. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting evening. And as you say, one way of entering this conversation is if we were both to read a little from our own work. And because poetry is easier to read in translation than prose, maybe both of us will read some. I brought with me a rather old book but a much loved book, something I enjoyed working on. This is called Through the Closed Doorway. This is published in 2004. And these are translations of the nazms, no ghazals here. I was still young, I was still finding my feet as a translator, and I thought it was either very brave or very foolhardy to translate the ghazal. So till this point, I was only translating the nazm. But Shahryar continues to be a personal favorite as a poet. And I've then eventually written a biography also many years later. But here, let me read something which Shahryar used as a dedication to one of his volumes, and I too used it in the beginning of this book. It's fairly simple, but I'll read the Urdu and then come to the English. Light is not very good, but let's see. मेरे लिए रात ने आज फराहम किया एक नया मरहला, नींदों से खाली किया, अश्कों से फिर भर दिया कांसा मेरी आँख का, और कहा कान में, मैंने हर एक जुर्म से तुमको बरी कर दिया, मैंने सदा के लिए तुम्हें रिहा कर दिया, जाओ जिधर चाहो तुम, जागो कि सो जाओ तुम, ख्वाब का दर बंद है. There's a finality to this nazm, and for a poet to use such a close-ended poem as the dedication to one of his volumes, I thought was intriguing. Listen to the translation. Tonight, the night presented me with a new dilemma. It emptied the basin of my eye of all sleep and filled it with tears. Then it whispered in my ear, I have absolved you of all sins and set you free forever. Go wherever you wish, sleep or stay awake. The doorway of dreams is closed for you. एक और छोटी सी इसलिए भी कि ये भी नज़्म है, गज़ल नहीं है. गज़ल की बात हम बाद में करेंगे. When in the course of the conversation, maybe we can talk about craft and the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts. So this is called एक काली नज़्म. मैं कोरे कागज़ पर लिखूं फिर एक काली नज़्म, अलग जगाते सन्नाटों से फिर से सजाऊं बज़्म, गद्दर अमरूदों की खुशबू पागल कर जाए, मेरी इन खाली आँखों को जल थल कर जाए, दूर दरिंदों की आवाज़ें खुद से लड़ती हों, मेरे उसके बीच में लंबी रातें पड़ती हों, शिकनों से आरी एक बिस्तर मुझको तकता हो, जिस मेरा आधा सोता आधा जगता हो, तब मैं करूं ये अज़्म कि लिखूं एक काली नज़्म. Now, in a nazm like this, it makes things easier for a poet, for a translator, because this particular nazm is all about the image. You know, vocabulary and syntax and the silences, those are tricky things in poetry. Sometimes the image can both help and distract. In this instance, I thought that the image helped me as a translator. And what are the images? Gaddar amrud, unripe, crunchy, green guavas. What are they doing when a man is talking about an uncreased bed? But it's there, you know, and it opens up so many possibilities. Also, if you will note, when I read the translation, somewhere he talks about lambi raat. I could very easily have said long night because that's the simplest thing to do. But do watch out for the word I eventually end up using, and I'll tell you why I did that. I remember it with sharp clarity, even though this was published in 2004. And I suppose I worked on this book 2003 or 4, but I remember very clearly that moment when I came to Lambi Raate. Let me write a black poem on virgin paper. Let me light up this banquet with unseen, formless silences. The smell of unripe guavas maddens me. It makes my empty eyes brim with wetness. Far away, wild animals growl and snap at each other. Between us lie endless nights. An uncreased bed stares at me. My body half sleeps, half wakes, and I resolve to write a black poem. Now, if there are any Agatha Christie fans here in this audience, you might recall a book by her, murder mystery, obviously, called Endless Night. Now, as a translator, at that instant, I don't know why, it flashed through my mind and it seemed entirely appropriate to say Endless Night with all its baggage of darkness and some sort of evil rather than a long night. So those are the little, I wouldn't call them liberties, but I'm not sure what the right word is, yeah? Maybe you could read yours now.
I think like everything else we do, we bring our biographies to translation. So, I mean, I've noticed that too. There are turns of phrase that come maybe from a cherished phrase in an Eliot poem, or it might be something else. I mean, it strikes you that that's the exact way to translate an 18th century poet, which might strike you as being odd. But let me read a few of these translations. This is from my book of, it already feels like it was many years ago, but I think it was just last year. Translation of a selection of ashar from Mir Taqi Mir's Divan of Ghazals. It's called The Homeland and Ocean. And I made a slightly eccentric choice, which was to not translate entire ghazals, because for all kinds of reasons, at least for this book, I'm arguing that that is a close to impossible task. This may not hold true in years to come, but two things happened. For one, I thought this might be a way of liberating the translation from impossible expectations, which work very well in the original language, but make for an obstacle course in English. And then there was just the beauty of the singular share, which is really, in the original instance, it's a poem by itself. And it also helped bring back a different social relationship to these poems. I found myself thinking of the bayaz, of the notebook, where people, readers, listeners in the first instance would take down a share that had appealed to them. And I thought, there might be a case here for the translation not trying to be completist, but getting something of that fragmentary, episodic, a love through the half-glimpsed, which speaks to the life of the original listeners of some of these poems. So this is the share that opens this selection. Shair ho, mat chupke raho, ab chup mein jaane jati hain. Baat karo, abyat padho, kuch baitein humko batate raho. You're a poet, don't be silent. Lives are lost under cover of silence. Speak up, read a couple of lines, read us verses, keep talking to us. And I have to say that as I went deeper and deeper into the Mir canon, what spoke most urgently to me was what I think of as the political Mir. I mean, there's an entire image, traditional, sanctified by criticism of Mir as a poet of thwarted love. And I thought here, if you read it closely, if you read it against the grain, it's alive with the experiences of a man who saw his city, his world, life world being destroyed around him, and who was exiled. And, that speaks so much to our present times, and very, very powerfully. Even in these lines, I was also struck very much by how this man lives in multiple registers of language. Now, the second line has two plurals for bet. So abyat is high Perso-Arabic, it's an elite usage, and betin is demotic. And in each case, What is haunting these lines is the notion of the home, which is also the poem. And even while he's seized by this anguish of the displaced person, he's still thinking about or working intuitively with the different languages that he inherits. So I hope as we go along, we'll also talk about where to place Urdu in the larger spectrum of languages that we have. Yeah. क्या जानू लोग कहते हैं किसको सुरूर कल्ब आया नहीं ये लफ्ज़ तो हिंदी ज़बां के बीच. How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance? That posh word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet. Which speaks to the fact that at the time Mir is writing, it's not even called Urdu. It doesn't get called Urdu till much, much later. As far as he's concerned, he's calling his language Hindi. And here is poking fun at people who are more Persianate in their usage. So this is something that I think attracted me greatly to Mir in the first place, the alertness to his medium, to the languages that he was hearing as he grew up. एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है लेकिन चक्कर रहता है, यानी वतन दरिया है उसमें चार तरफ हैं सफर में अब. Like the whirlpool, still center of a giddy circling, the homeland's an ocean that scatters us in all directions.
So there are ghazal poets like Faiz and Ghalib who are amazing editors of their own work. There is no flab in the divan or in the ghazal. And then you have Mir, blessed with a long life, lives through the long durée of the 18th century, lives through a very tumultuous time, politically, historically, socially, financially, every which way, as you mentioned, is exiled from Delhi, goes away, lives in straitened circumstances and all of that, but continues to write very, very profusely. Now, one of my favorite poets, Zehra Nigah, who lives in Karachi, she uses a wonderful expression for Mir. Bharti ke sher hain, which means padding, you see, and as a reader, as somebody who loves Mir, she can spot that padding. So some poets have them and some don't. Some resist the impulse to edit, self-edit. Now in Faiz, you will not find one Bharti ka sher in a ghazal, and you will not find one Bharti ki ghazal in a divan, right? And Mir has so much. So as you say, which is very interesting, what you've done in this book, you know, what was the word you used? Completeness. Not a completist. Completist, sorry, yeah. So, as translators, some of us are worried and anxious about this business of completeness, of fidelity to the wholeness of a text. What you've done is interesting because in Urdu, while a ghazal has its own place, but so do the sher. I mean, there are so many sher that you just, एक शेर याद है पूरी गज़ल का, वो या तो बैतबाजियों में इस्तेमाल होता है या रोज़मर्रा की ज़बान में इस्तेमाल होता है या वो टू मेक अ पॉइंट इस्तेमाल होता है. एक ज़माना था, शायद आप में से कुछ लोगों को याद हो, पार्लियामेंट तक में शेर व शायरी होती थी, जब अदालतों में इतनी होती थी. अब तो एक मुहिम छिड़ी हुई है कि एक एक वर्ड को उर्दू के प्लक आउट करके वीड आउट करेंगे हम. बहरहाल, तो एक ज़माना था जब फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर्स बजट प्रेजेंट करते थे तो भी शेर के साथ करते थे. तो ये एक रिवायत है, एक तरीका है कि आपको गज़ल पूरी ना भी याद हो तो आपको शेर याद होता था. This kind of brings me, Ranjit, to this whole business of maybe we need to talk about this. Fidelity, faithfulness, vexing issues, completeness. You give yourself the liberty to choose. Now, is subjectivity a bad word for a translator? I don't think so. You see, हम literary translators हैं, हम commercial translators नहीं हैं, हम washing machine के instructions नहीं translate कर रहे हैं. उसमें आप step 2 के बजाय step 4 पे चले गए और आपने step 3 miss कर दिया, तो you're not being true to your task. हम शायद, do you think we have that luxury? Maybe we misuse it.
I don't think it's a liberty. I think it's a necessary condition of how we translate, because it's this has been my answer to people. Two things that I often cite in this in this context, because usually you're asked this question, no, but is this a literal translation? So Daisy Rockwell has a way of answering that. She tends to say, when people ask her, so what is lost in your translation? So she says, everything. Everything is lost. And then I start from the ground up, which is a robust American way of thinking about it, which I admire. And my version of that is also to say that there is no literal original. So when you're looking at a literary text, exactly as you said, it has a play of tonalities, it has shades of meaning, words have changed their meaning, they're dislocated. You're approaching it from a different historical experience. It's not a neutral act. So you cannot have a literal translation because you're also responding to different kinds of claims that these lines are making on you. So, yeah. So it does.
So this business of loss, I think, speaking for myself, it is something I factor in. I mean, one would be blithe and heedless to not factor it in. Of course, the idea of loss is there in my mind, but I work on the principle that some amount of loss is inevitable, right? Maybe if I was working between sister languages, Hindi, Urdu, or for that matter, the bhashas, the Indian languages, let's say I was translating from Urdu to Udiya, for example, right? Let's say I was. There would be many things. The word sondhi, khushbu, I wouldn't have to go looking for moist, damp. I certainly wouldn't use petrichor. Even if I was at death's door, I wouldn't use it. But I might use other things. But with Uriya or Tamil, I wouldn't be so anxious. But in languages as dissimilar as Urdu and English, of course, there is loss. I mean, you take words, meanings, sensibilities, sensitivities across the picket fences of languages. So I think loss is inevitable. But the gains are enormous. Let's sort of kind of move a little away from poetry, which is the glamorous sibling here, and prose and fiction, non-fiction tends to sort of occupy us less. Though, frankly, speaking for myself, I've done more translations from prose than poetry. The context, I think, is very important, yeah? 92, when I first published my very first translation, HarperCollins had just opened shop, and I translated 12 of Premchand's short stories. The copyright had just freed. And I wrote a very modest 2-page translator's note. And I thought my work is done. My brief to myself as a translator was just that, you know, I be as faithful, as accurate, as close to the original, and as felicitous as possible. But I don't go beyond that. In these 30 odd years from 92 to now, I think my brief to myself has kind of expanded. Yeah, I feel that I have moved from the text, which continues to be important, which I continue to read closely, which is my primary text. But one wants to give something more. And I remember when my translation of Intizar Hussein's Aage Samandar Hai came, one reviewer was slightly pissed by my, what he, she, whoever, called my relentless use of footnotes. And they wondered, what are footnotes doing in a translation? Now, I think as translators, we have to find ways and means. We can write a long introductory essay, we can add introductions. We can't clutter the original with what we think we want to do. I don't think our job is to gild the lily or to make things easy. But where there is a cultural context, if Intizar Hussain is talking about a billy cat, Ananya, this one's for you. A cat from Cordoba who appears in Bulandshahr. Now, you need to, Urdu readers are okay. बिल्ली का जिक्र है, कॉर्डोबा का जिक्र है, बुलंदशहर का हो गया, कोई बात नहीं. The English reader is going to wonder, ये बिल्ली कहाँ से आई, क्यों आई? And then you need to talk about this whole, this obsession with Cordoba, what it means, this looking back and hearkening to past glories, and the cat and Andalusia. The cat fits in very nicely there. But I think that English reader needs a little bit of hand holding. What are your views on this?
It's amazing you should offer this example, because in that single line is such a tapestry of interconnected histories, which many people are just simply unaware of, I find. I remember it was a conference somewhere where I was talking about Don Quixote as a divana, as a kalandar. And there's a very well-meaning French colleague who came up to me and said, "You know, you've really misunderstood this novel." So at which point I had to say, no, it's just that you're not looking at the 700 years that went before that novel. And if you read the novel, Cervantes himself says it's based on a manuscript that Sidi Ben Engeli wrote. So he's very aware of the past of Al-Andalus. But if you just say a cat from Cordoba, I mean, when you say that to me, I'm also thinking of Iqbal's pilgrimage to a city that used to be called Al-Cordoba. So
and
how
the
do
very
you...
posed photograph he got taken again.
Yeah, exactly. So we are ambassadors of the original text in some ways. So we can't always assume that this knowledge is still current. So I think far from decrying footnotes and annotation, I think all that apparatus around the text is crucial. I don't think they're forbidding or formidable gestures. They're actually gestures of invitation.
Absolutely, because you are inviting the reader to enter this landscape. Maybe there are things that are, well, alien or new, or especially for younger readers. Also, for the Urdu readers of a certain generation, which is Intizar Hussein's language, for example, seems to me frozen in the 1930s. Yeah? So even though he went to Pakistan in 1948 and had a long innings as a writer, lived in Lahore, but the language he uses is very Western Uttar Pradesh 1930s. I think a language that he heard his aunts use and so on. So he will use words and expressions that have gone out of currency, even for an Urdu speaker. So my mother sitting here, I remember asking her about many expressions which were just sort of idiomatic Urdu, yeah? And obviously I won't find it in a dictionary. These were expressions, everyday expressions, and I'm drifting a little here, but Gail Mino has a wonderful coinage, Begmati Zuban, yeah? Now, this is the language that people of my grandmother's generation spoke in Western Uttar Pradesh, for example, right? And Gail Mino has got it right when she says that Ismat began using it like a literary tool, like a literary device. So this रची बसी मुहावरों से रची बसी ज़बान के मियाँ इधर आ जाओ वहाँ कहाँ से खूब छुपते भी नहीं सामने आते भी नहीं. So the idea of using a fragment of poetry embedded in a conversation seamlessly. This was everyday language. And Ismat Chughtai, and before her actually Rashid Jahan, hit upon the idea of bringing it into literature and saying nothing is beyond the ken of literature. Let's bring everything in. Yeah? And I think there was a time when poets were doing it too, I mean, the literary vocabulary was not so sharply divided as I now find it. I find in the modern day poet, I find them, and writer, fiction writer, what truly troubles me is a kind of a political correctness. They want to press all the right buttons, even if they're talking about something prickly, like, let's say, communalism. Right. They will want to have a fig leaf of something or the other, So I think we've moved very swiftly and very far away from a Manto or a Bedi or a Nismat or people like this who were calling a spade in literature and were not shy of bringing their politics into literature.
But I wonder if that was also because they had a better sense of who their readers were and in what ways those readers could be provoked even. I think for many of us now, I'm not sure we really know who our readers are. Or maybe the readership is atomized, maybe we ourselves feel somehow disconnected to larger social formations. I don't know, what's your take on that?
On Monday, I will be speaking at an event organized by the University of Chicago office in Delhi as a tribute to CM Naeem Saab, as he was called, the legendary sort of teacher of Urdu in America. I think the work you and I and people of our generation are doing, I think we have, it's people like Naeem Saab, and before that, Ralph Russell, older by about 20 odd years than Naeem Saab. It is people like this. I think, talking of audiences, a Ralph Russell or a CM Naeem knew who they were writing for. We don't seem to know that. At least I am not very sure. I'm not entirely very sure. So, but Ralph Russell was writing for departments of South Asia, for students of South Asian studies, much the same way in America, where at the undergrad level people do both Hindi and English. So the undergrad student will know equal amounts of Hindi literature and Urdu literature. I don't think that's happening here anymore. And that lopsidedness, unevenness, I think is visible in the text that we are picking up to translate. And I don't know if you've been translating any modern stuff, but when I go looking at modern Indian fiction, I'm kind of, perforce I have to use it because it's a task I've given myself. I want to know what is happening in the here and now. But in a purely literary sense, it's worrying. The craft is loose, flaccid, uneven. So when we take it upon ourselves to translate that, I think our job becomes that much harder.
I agree. Sometimes as a translator, because translators have to be it's the closest form of reading, actually, because you're teasing out things, and sometimes you stumble over problems or errors, and then it's an ethical question of what to do with that. So I understand that completely. But just to pursue this question of who our readers are, I think which is why I think we also thought about translating for tomorrow.
Yeah.
It pulls me back to this question of, which you flagged, of context, and why it's important to have these annotations and introductions, because the way in which collective memory is being reprogrammed, there is so much that will simply be erased from the record, so that texts will not be intelligible in certain ways. So I have a feeling that's part of the larger frame of our problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, even when you're looking at texts from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, I don't really like that term zeitgeist, but there was a certain zeitgeist there. There were certain things, values held in common, shared traumas. How do we take that across to generations that have no stake in this, or who have no memory of it, or there's no continuity with these questions?
Yeah.
I now find when I'm talking to people much younger, there's a very dim memory of Ayodhya, 92.
Yeah.
There's,
or Gujarat, for that
or
matter.
Gujarat,
Go
exactly.
to Ahmedabad and
Yeah.
say, nothing happened.
Exactly. So I'm thinking these are crises we lived through. They were traumas. They were experienced as traumas. And they mean nothing to younger people. How then do we go back to these earlier decades and retrieve why certain texts are urgent and how we need to approach them?
Yeah. Having said that, partition studies is actually being taught in a bunch of universities. So while we all, those of us who are outside academia, love to diss academia. But having said that, I think some fine work is happening in these partition studies departments, Jadavpur, Jamia, to some extent Delhi University, though not a dedicated department, but yeah, various PhD scholars are coming out with. And the good thing here is the even-handedness of the new translations that we're seeing on partition. All this while we've been concentrating on the Punjab side, and we've not really taken into account the many Bangla texts, the Assamia texts that have come and that have talked about the partition. So I think that unevenness is to some extent being rectified. So do you think we should take questions, or do you want us to ramble on? Okay.
No, I thought about something that came to mind. I was also thinking about our journeys to translation. It might be interesting to think about what started us off and why there was so. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Take first shot? Okay, sheer serendipity. I used to be working at a place not far from here, the India International Center, and my boss sent me off for some errand I've forgotten to the Sahitya Academy. And then I meet this very avuncular person, the editor of Indian Literature, Sahitya Academy's magazine, a certain Dr. Rao. And apropos nothing, he opens a drawer, fishes out a Xerox and hands it to me and said, आपको देख के लग रहा है कि आपकी अंग्रेजी तो ठीक ही है, हिंदी उर्दू कुछ आती है? मैंने कहा जी दोनों आती है, तो आप ये ट्रांसलेट करके मुझे दे दीजिए. And I'm like this, I haven't done any translations. हाँ लेकिन आपकी ज़बान लगता ठीक ही होगी, आप करके दे दीजिए. And this is Premchand's Mandir Masjid. And I translated, you know, in my father's old Remington dash away, and he publishes it without any fuss in Indian literature. And I am like this person who has tasted blood. There is no other way, Ranjit, of explaining this. I was leading a perfectly happy life, drifting from here to there, doing nothing in particular. And then I am this person on a mission. All thanks to Dr. Rao, who fishes out one fine day a story and says, "Aap isko translate kar dijiye." So serendipity in my case has had a very, very strong role to play. And in those, I mentioned the Premchand book, which I did, which came out of this one story, Mandir Masjid. And the book was also called Mandir Masjid. And here a shout out to HarperCollins. 92 to now, whatever, 33 years, they've kept that book in currency. They've had 3 reprints. And even today, you can walk into a bookshop and you can find a revised 3rd edition of The Temple and the Mosque. Sometimes I ask myself, would I do this differently? I ask my young self, I was in my late 20s, I think then, would I translate these stories differently? Possibly I would. I think we all, this is an exercise maybe we should set ourselves, right, Ranjit? Yeah, revisit our early translations and ask ourselves, set it for ourselves as a task. Would I translate this story or this poem differently? Have you thought of that?
I have actually. Going back to some early translations and thinking about why I would do this differently. Do I have a different sense of why language should be supple? Was I taking liberties then that I wouldn't take today? I mean, these are valid questions.
But talk about your first translation.
Yeah, well, actually, it began with really seeing myself as an apprentice to many languages. And I have to say my journey is conditioned by the fact that I am an Anglophone poet. And in the 80s and 90s, there was still a very strong defensiveness if you were an Indian writing in English. This may have diminished now, but at that point you were looked upon as some kind of linguistic traitor. And, you know, you would go to Sahitya Academy conferences and everywhere it'd be the Deshabhashas, and then they would look at you and say, okay, these are the English writers. And then you would say, well, no, we're Indians, but, you know, never mind.
It was just the opposite in the Litfest scenes, remember that?
Yeah, that too. Exactly. But in these scenarios, and then you know, gradually it came to me that, you know, I don't need to be sitting inside this citadel of being an Anglophone poet because I am a multilingual reader. And although I'm a monolingual writer, how do I bring these energies from these other languages into what I'm doing? And at that point, it was marvelous to have had living exemplars like Aga Shahid Ali, Dilip Chitre, Arvind Mehrotra, and A.K. Ramanujan. Now, all of these figures came through Bombay for one reason or another. So I think it was really a privilege in my late teens to have been able to really to meet these people, to learn from them, and it was a vast sense of expansion. I mean, you talk of tasting blood. To me, again, there was a certain magic to being able to bring things over from other languages, and I've really never lost that sense of enchantment. So, and then there were other biographical.
It would be a sad day, wouldn't it? I think it would be a sad day for us as translators if we were to lose that sense of enchantment.
Yeah, I think that the sense of encounter with another text, with the alchemy of how you bring it across, I think that's something that keeps us going. So speaking of early translations, I think there were really two. One, for deeply biographical reasons, was the Lal Ded, the Poems of Lalla that I was launched on. This was by way of retrieving an ancestral past and language that had been lost for reasons of diaspora, but which very soon became much larger than just my individual journey back to the roots. It was very demanding, that particular 20-year process, because it was also the 20 worst years in Kashmir's history. So there was a profound awareness that I wasn't translating a fossil text from the past. There was a responsibility to the people, the language, the place, which also helped open up the linguistic textures of the corpus. You know, you realize when you look at the linguistic evidence that it's been composed over centuries. So that particular translation for me was also an ethical and a political experience. You feel you're bearing witness to all these anonymous contributors who've composed under the saint's name. Yeah. So that's for me that was a very formative experience. Yeah. And it's kind of come into the Mir as well, where again there's a very strong sense of bearing witness to a language that is being stigmatized, compartmentalized in a certain way, subjected to deeply vicious communal politics, and in the process of which we've lost our own sense of how rich we are as linguistic subjects.
Would you translate Lalla Ded differently today?
I've actually been thinking about some of the works, particularly I would probably translate in a different way. But doesn't that happen to us as readers as well? I mean, I remember reading King Lear when I was in school, and I thought, what a silly old man. And then years later, I was, as a much, in my mid-20s, there was clearly some slight element of wisdom had crept in. Yeah. I just found myself in tears thinking about this predicament, I think it also has to do with our own arc of experience and how we've changed as human beings.
Yeah. So let me talk about something personal, which actually ties up with my journey as a translator. Sometime in my 40s, I decided to do a PhD for no particular reason. It had nothing to do with job enhancement or, any of those things professionally or anything. But it was, in a sense, at that point I wasn't sure, but in that sense, now with hindsight I see, it was a groping for all the random reading I'd done till that point. And one has read a fair amount by the time one is in one's 40s, especially if one has a librarian for a mother, then you're, introduced to books very early on. And I wanted to see if all of these things that I've been reading, if all of these texts that I've been translating, am I able to join the dots? And oddly enough, I could. Obviously, I was not reading right-wing stuff. So therefore, there was a kind of a coherence to my reading till that point. And the people I had translated, Manto, Rashida Masadehi, Krishan Chandar, Ismat, all of these people, there was a nice coming together. So it seemed to make sense to go looking for what was the glue that brought this diverse body of writers together to form this glittering galaxy known as the Progressive Writers Association. Yeah? And we've never, unfortunately, ever been able to see writers coming together. We have an occasional spurt, like an award wapsi or something like that, but it peters out, it dies out, it's a flash in the pan. Now, this movement is a pan-Indian movement. It goes into all the bhashas. The Progressive Writers movement is a pan-Indian phenomena that starts from the 30s in a very sort of organized way. Of course, there are traces in Manto's early writing. There's traces of progressive writing in Premchand, in Upendranath Ashk, and so many people. But it's with the establishment of an association, it's the establishment of branches in different state capitals that a movement is formed. So it was very, very interesting for me to see how diverse people come together, and in the early years, the glue that binds them is nationalism. Yeah. And then that set me thinking that once our freedom has been achieved, once we are an independent nation, bifurcated of course, what happens to that glue? Does that movement sort of separate, scatter? It does scatter, but not for any one reason. So that's a very simplistic answer, that this glue is removed and so people scatter. A whole bunch of things happen, and also over the years. And so when you look at a big movement like that, I mean, your thesis is done, you get your degree, and it's something that hangs on your wall, and that's about it. But in this instance, because this movement is so rich, because this association of writers is so varied, their work, their corpus is so vast, one is able to, as a translator, as a reader, revisit these texts. And some of them wrote prolifically. Krishan Chandra had this huge oeuvre. I mean, it's a gagar mein sagar. It's a drop in the ocean. Aapne ek kitab kar li, ek story kar li, ek novel kar li, but there's still so much waiting to be read, explored, translated. So I think I hit upon the mother lode. I'm pretty sorted for the next many, many years, you know, because there's always something coming out, you know. And the Rashid Jahan biography. I was appalled that I treated this marvelous woman like a footnote in my literary history. And then I said, no, I've got to rectify this. And then I, you know, translated her stories, wrote her biography. So I wonder if something like this has happened to you, that I'm very clear that the progressives are my happy space, you know, my métier, or whatever you want to call it. Do you have any such, okay, now I'm sorted, I have this to always fall back on? Do you have something like that?
I wish. No, for me,
why not Mir? Because Mir will keep giving you. It's the wine that produces.
Right, yeah, the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah. But it's part of something like your discovery of this historical armature. For me, it's the 18th century across the arts and culture, because for a long time the 18th century was, now there's a lot of work on it by academics in different disciplines, but it was a very inconvenient century. It didn't fit very well into nationalist accounts because there was no nation, and you couldn't easily bring it into an imperial history because it was pre-empire, and there were all kinds of incredible encounters happening there. People from Europe, from West Asia, from Southeast Asia. There was such a swirling confluence of people and ideas here. There was so much activity, so many new centers were emerging, and figures like me, Agra, exactly, yeah. And also the Deccan. I mean, for some reason we tend to think about North and South as very different. When you get to the 18th century, you realize that it's a fairly meaningless binary because people were circulating constantly. Yeah. So, you know, it's really in Golconda or Aurangabad that you have
even
the early history.
Ahmedabad,
Exactly,
even Gujarat.
Absolutely, which is why one, if you will, proto-variant of Urdu is called Gujri. Yeah. It's a way of curing ourselves from the narrowness that we have as modern subjects. So for me, the 18th century in general is this kind of world from which amazing possibilities emerge that we can go back to. So Mir represents that in large measure, but I'm also thinking of, you know, what then happens with the arrival of print. You know, this speaks to something you flagged earlier about how Ghalib and Faiz, poets like that, were so editorially conscious, but they also lived off their own work. But Ghalib was able to preside over at least 5 editions in print of his work. He had a very strong sense of what a printed divan meant, and what should go, yeah. Whereas Mir, I'm thinking of how this man has to escape to the Jat strongholds. He doesn't live in Delhi for 10 years. Comes back, and then he's displaced again voluntarily, goes to Lucknow. I'm just thinking, how did he carry all his manuscripts? And what was his sense of them? And then he dies a year before his work appears in print. So he doesn't come into print modernity, and therefore doesn't have that kind of consciousness of what will this look like as an edition. So, yeah.
I think we're getting some signs from there. Maybe we can take questions now. Are there any mics?
There's Jancy, and there's a question here, and...
Hello, thank you both so much. It was amazing, really, really fascinating. I've been jotting down notes as you speak, and I wanted to kind of come back to what you were saying about footnotes, but also about history and our current predicament. 2 of my favourite translators ever, one is Peter Avery, who translated The Conference of the Birds with extensive footnotes, a book within a book. And Arunava Sinha, who tells a marvellous story but doesn't necessarily believe in labouring a point or, you know, kind of extrapolating. So I wonder, as a teacher, speaking as a teacher, at a time of what we can only really describe as cultural annihilation often, and while we're exposed to history being deleted before our eyes, how can the translators, that's you both, of today, bring a vital awareness of historical context and political nuance to the text itself? I know you've both talked a lot about this already, but you know, to say in brief, is it paring meaning down to the bare body by arriving at some kind of universal truth, or by elaborating detail, expanding text if necessary, to give like a Gen Z or even a Gen Alpha readership who don't really believe that anything happened before the year 2000, context and profound understanding of these fragmented times in which we inhabit.
Please go ahead. I'll see what I can pick up later.
Oh gosh. Okay. You know, I've always been a fan of elaborate annotation, and I just see it as, I like the phrase you used, a book within a book, and I like it for multiple reasons. I guess it's from reading eccentrics like Richard Burton, and Anand Kumaraswamy, less eccentric, but there are some Kumaraswamy essays where the actual essay might be 5 pages, and then the footnotes continue grandly for another 20 pages, and I like that way of approaching texts. I mean, there is, of course, an original, but then there's other things that I think it's also an interesting way of inviting readers into whatever project you're presenting. You can read the book in any way you like. Read the text as translated, the introduction, the annotations, and so on. And I think it might actually be a more interesting way of bringing people into the discussion of what you're doing. And it grows ever more urgent for the reasons you flagged and we've been talking about. How to give your reader a vibrant sense of what these experiences were like. I think increasingly as a translator and as a writer, this is important to me. Not empirical facts by themselves, but some way of conveying them in an animated way.
No, I agree entirely, and I personally love footnotes, and I don't subscribe to the view that footnotes are an academic tool, so they should be confined to academic writing. I think these demarcations and boundaries are really very silly. Also, there's an actual reason why I think we should use more footnotes. We can't labor the text. We can't insert meaning that is not there, where the writer assumes is to be understood by their readers, right? The readership has changed. Niche of forgetfulness. That's the translation. Now, Intizar Hussain, yes, but Intizar, it's a Ghalib image, but Intizar Hussain constantly uses it in his prose. Why? Because his readers have read enough Ghalib to instantly be able to understand what niche of forgetfulness is. Now, it's at one level a very literal translation, niche of forgetfulness. आपने अपने दिमाग में से निकाल के एक ताक में रख दी और भूल गए. But it's a spiritual meaning also. Now, I feel that my job is also to provide that context, which is why I increasingly see my 30-odd year journey as a journey from text to context. I'm no longer just happy with translating a text. Our jobs, we're not in the business of electronic transfers of meanings. It's not like you pluck from one vocabulary bank and you transfer into another vocabulary bank and pay some service tax and you're done. No, you know. So I think our job is also to provide that context, which this reader, a young reader like Tanimare may not understand, that there is a spiritual context or Sufi meaning to the niche of forgetfulness, which maybe my mother's generation did because she could instantly make the connection with Ghalib, because they'd read both. Yeah? So I think times change, readerships change, audiences change. And I think that's why our job has to be flexible.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah, so I have a very basic question. What is the difference between Hindi and Urdu when it comes to pronunciation? I feel it's the epiglottis, you know. So if you could elaborate, yeah. Really? It is the epiglottis.
No. You answer this one. No, you've answered your own question actually. It is the epiglottis. It is the nuqta. And
Yeah.
those of us, let me answer this more seriously actually. There's a plan B for everything. That ठीक है हमें उर्दू स्क्रिप्ट नहीं आती लेकिन हम देवनागरी में पढ़ लेंगे. बट सवाल ये है कि देवनागरी इज़ नॉट इक्विप्ड टू गिव यू द काफ साउंड, द गैन साउंड, द एन साउंड. आप नुक्ता लगा दीजिए लेकिन उसको फल को फल ही बोलेंगे लोग. बड़ा मज़ा आया. आई एम कॉल्ड रखशंदा जलील. जहाँ नुक्ते की ज़रूरत नहीं है वहाँ नुक्ता लगाते हैं, और जहाँ नुक्ता है, नुक्ता मीन्स डॉट, जहाँ नुक्ता है मज़ा आया और जलील, जहाँ ज़रूरत नहीं है वहाँ नुक्ता लगा देंगे तो वो मतलब ही बदल जाएगा. तो खेल तो नुक्ते का है.
I might
Hello.
just, no.
Yeah.
There's a question. Oh, yeah. No, just to link it to the larger history where we see these as somehow different and even antagonistic languages. And I noticed that some of that non-debate is swirling around Francesca Orsini in these times. You want to say, sorry, but the standardized Sanskritic Hindi that we now regard as timeless is about 100 years old. And it comes out of the pages of a journal called Saraswati. And that's not a prejudice. It's just a historicizing of a language. And to place it in a larger spectrum of marvelous linguistic evolution. So if we just see this why the Mir thing, Mir introduction, work with this notion of a Hindavi spectrum. It's a way of thinking about related languages from Western Rajasthan to Telangana, and from the Himalayan foothills to Aurangabad. Suddenly you have a sense that, what is amazing here is the overlapping, the interrelationships among languages. So I would, as a footnote, append this linguistic appeal of mine to your question. There are, of course, differences among the languages in the spectrum, but what's more interesting is that they are a tapestry and they have a possibility of being common ground.
Yes, there's one question this side. Yeah. Firstly, it's been a great conversation, and which we have been thoroughly enjoying, and very insightful indeed. And especially what you say about footnoting, I also tend to agree with that. And I think we cannot forget that T.S. Eliot, that iconic poet, and his Wasteland, without all those footnotes, much of it would be lost to the readers. Because, somewhere the reader's scholarship very often does not meet the writers. And so footnotes are needed. But my question is a little different. Rakhshanda, you talked about how you regretted that you had not, looked at Rashid Jahan properly, and then later you came out with your wonderful book about her. My question to you is that when you translate a text written by a woman writer, as a translator, do you sense any kind of difference in terms of, the vocabulary that women tend to use, or the texture of it, as opposed to male writers? Or is it that you don't subscribe to this category, women's writing, because that's also a very contested space? So as a translator, what has been your experience, because you have translated Rashid Jahan?
I find this a very difficult question to answer because, I don't believe that women's writing is or should be of interest to women only. Like Dalit writing is only by Dalits for Dalits and therefore to be accessed and interpreted or translated by Dalits. I think it'd be a small world if we began. So yeah, in the case of Rashid Jahan, I'm mindful of the fact but there is a historical context. She is using something that Ismat is going to later do in a much more vibrant and vivid way. But Rashid Jahan's own mother's family is from the Farash Khana neighborhood in Old Delhi, and she's a doctor, a lady doctor, and so she meets women from all social strata, the wealthy and the really poor and disempowered. So I think, and she's a Marxist. Let's not forget that. That's very, very important in her writing. Her being a Marxist, her being a doctor, her being a writer, I think is very important. Her being a woman, I suspect, is secondary. That's my sense. And so all of these things inform her writings. And because she meets the woman who's pulling the pankha where the Begum is sitting, and she's talking to both the Begum and the pankhe wali, she is able to bring those different registers. And my job is, as a translator, is to make sure that I'm faithful to the register of the pankhe wali woman, who is an illiterate woman from the village, who's just pulling the pankha while the Begum's lolling about. And I should be able to transfer the register of the Begum and the language that she is using, which is actually different from the more rustic register of the other woman. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm mindful of it. But I don't subscribe to the view that women's writing, as a woman, I must react to it. Or I think of myself as a writer when I'm not translating. I certainly don't think of myself as a woman writer. I don't think of myself as a woman translator, if there is such a thing.
A lady translator.
Man translator, your male translator.
Oh gosh, it reminds me of that other ghastly word which people have now thankfully stopped using, poetess.
Hi. I was wondering over here. Hello. I was wondering, throughout your translations careers, have you find that the English you're using is also changing and taking on aspects of the languages that you're translating from?
Truly.
It's also ageist because we are, I don't know about you, I'm 62, so yeah, I've had a long innings as a translator. So yeah.
56. Oh gosh. Yes. And when I look back, I think about, this speaks to that earlier question which you had, would we translate things differently? Yeah. The shape of every language changes, and so we're very aware that the texts we're looking at, like you said of Intezar Hussain, it is what it is from the 1930s. But our language, frozen in time, but we cannot have a frozen equivalent. So in what ways does our own linguistic usage change? I think that is crucial to me. But with me, it also there's a particular resonance for that question, because particularly in the Lal Ded translation, I was committed to really restoring the robust nature of the original in what I was doing. And I think that text has suffered many prior translations which were very ornate. There used to be a certain Victorian Orientalist way of translating the sacred texts of the East. It all was very ponderous and somewhere between Tennyson and Swinburne. And I wanted to do away with that, which led me, I think, towards more, what's the word I want? Spoken kind of usage in certain ways. So for me, it's also true of the Mir translation. Some people have been a bit mildly startled by some of the choices which strike them as being contemporary. But my point is, this man was contemporary then. I need to be true to that. So yeah, I think for all of us, the way in which our language, again, I detest that military metaphor, the target language, it's changing, and we need to take account of that.
I won't be able to give you an exact example, but I would imagine, and I'm going to go home and think about it, I would imagine that vocabulary-wise, certainly, I'm using different, maybe, words than I did 30 years ago, because I've read more things or different things over these 30-odd years than I had done till that point. And somewhere, surely, what I read must be influencing. I gave you the example of Endless Night, but stuff like that, So, yeah, but this needs to one needs to think about this and have a more coherent answer for maybe another time. Yeah, it's an interesting question actually to ask.
I'm terrible at finding examples in whatever I've written, but luckily here comes one. Mir, मेरे तगीरे हाल पर मत जा, इत्तेफाकात हैं ज़माने के. Don't go by how things have panned out for me. Stuff happens.
Panned out stuff. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
I had a question here. It's Ananya. Hi. As a scholar, I've been trained to read many languages, and so translation is something I've been familiar with from, the beginning of my academic life. But as a literary translator, I just completed my first exercise by translating a book of my father's poetry from Hindi into English. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I take my hat off to both of you because, you do this voluntarily and you do it endlessly, indeed. But I had a question that, now that I've become sensitive to the difference between translation and a philological treatment of texts. And I understand that it takes both linguistic training as well as literary sensitivity and literary knowledge to actually do a good job of translation. I find it very alarming that more and more we read about how large language models and AI are going to eliminate the translator as, as a useful and contributor to human society. And the idea that, if you simply feed enough information and enough texts into a program, an artificial intelligence model, that it's going to be able to basically handle any text and render it from language A to language B with greater and greater finesse, ultimately eliminating the human intervention altogether. I cannot accept that this is possible, because precisely of the kinds of personal and subjective and experiential and serendipitous things that you both mentioned as going into the work of translation. But on the basis of this kind of a prediction, I mean, they're eliminating programs of language study, departments of literary study, and so on, even at the best universities in the world, especially at those universities. So I'd like to hear from both of you, your feelings on this. I mean, are you, people like you, going to become redundant? And I mean, do you believe that? Does this not trouble you or disturb you as much as it does somebody like me who's a reader?
Gosh, I was going to say ittifaqat hain zamane ke, but I will resist that. Do you want to go first?
You take first shot.
I'm very skeptical of this. It's actually strange. Motoshi, who's here, and I were just talking about how, whether it's in editing or in translation, models based on the possibility that artificial intelligence can eventually do and do better what we do, they may improve efficiency of a certain kind. But I think, as emerged already in what we've said, what we've read and shared, there is something elusive and unpredictable to cultural work, to cultural activity. And I can't believe that however maximal you might get in aggregating data and patterns, this is the kind of thing that will particularly not show up there. Because I think that a lot of the work we do is based on ruptures, breakthroughs, epiphanies, whether we are translators or poets or painters or whatever else we do in the sphere of culture. This is not premised on necessarily on consistencies that will just propagate themselves.
So Ranjit's answered the second part of your question, Ananya, but you also flagged the translation that you do for your work. I find myself doing that too. There is need-based translations. Let's say you're writing an op-ed, or let's say you're writing an essay, or a paper that you need to read at a seminar, and you need to embed little bits and pieces of poetry or text from another language in it. I see that as need-based translations. So every now and then one does that. And then there is the stamina that you need for a standalone text. So while you didn't really ask us that, you were actually going towards your question about AI and so on, let me just make that distinction here for those who might be interested. I see that as a sprint runner and a marathon runner. You know, you do a quick dash and you're done, whatever, 400 meters or whatever it's called. And then you do your marathon. The Intezar Hussain book, I think I did it over a year. And I finished it during one Ramzan of the following year. I would be awake, my circadian rhythm had changed, and I would be working at night and sort of doing other sleeping and so on in the day. And that's when I managed to finish it. But it took me a year of work on a 300-page book while I was doing other things during that year. So there are these, I don't know how other people work, but I have multiple projects going on. I pluck one, concentrate on it, sort of put it away on some back burner, pick up another one. So there is a stamina that is required, a perseverance, or you come up with another word for it, but something that makes you hold on to that, you know? And you might drop it for a while or put it at the back, but you pick it up again, and then you find yourself back at that spot where you'd left it. And that is not so for something that is need-based, for a paper, for an intervention, or an academic, whatever essay you might be writing. You do that on the go, you know.
Shiv, are you hoping that there are no more questions?
No, not at all.
No, I'm just teasing you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. You both talked about text and context in the context of what you both do. Do you, so there are two sort of very small questions out of this. One, do you see yourself as almost curators more than writers in a sense? And two, the idea that you are now, like for instance, you said कि हम गजल नहीं कर रहे हैं, हम उसमें से शेर निकाल के translate कर रहे हैं. Do you think you're able to do that because you are now, you also talked about your first translation versus what you're doing now. Do you think a young translator would still be able to get away with some of those choices or would be accepted for some of those choices? या जैसे उम्र का तकाजा होता है कि भाई तो अब आप कर रहे हैं तो इसलिए
I think this has to do with substantiating your choice. So I don't think it has much to do with how young you are or old you are, how many years you've put in. I think if you're making a choice of this kind, this particular example, for instance, of the ashar as units rather than the entire ghazal, if you make a case for that and then show how you're actually not only retrieving a poem but also a social context of reading and listening, I think that's of interest. I think if you can, so that it's not a whimsical choice. So that would be my immediate response to that. I think that's what I cherish when I read other people's translations, like people who've translated Sappho, for instance, the Greek poet. How are they dealing with fragments and silences, for instance? I mean, so these formal and technical questions, which have larger resonances, I think that's what's of interest.
From the beautiful example he's given to the really banal, Kanishk, when I started in '92, there were people before me, such as Jay Ratan, who were translating from Urdu and Hindi, and they were very prolific, and their translations were everywhere. I don't wish to diss this generation of translators because they were literally going where no man had gone before, quite literally. And so this is what we had in the market, Manto and Krishna Chandar and others, done by people like Jayaratan. But they felt the need to say clarified butter instead of ghee. Yeah, they felt the need to say stringed caught in the sentence, not in a glossary, not in a footnote, in the translation. Then by the time my generation comes along, we say, no, forget it, we are going to say ghee, you know. So with time, a certain self-confidence, not audacity, but a certain confidence comes that when as an 18-year-old, I read Homer for the first time as an undergraduate English student, and two of my friends are sitting here from college. We were 18-year-olds straight out of school. We'd never read Homer. We didn't know what he meant when he talked about the wine dark seas and all of that. But we understood. Nobody was holding us by the hand and taking us into that landscape, that literary landscape. So why do we now want to make everything easy for the young readers, you know? Let's use ghee, let's use khala jan, let's not use the generic aunt and uncle, you know? Let's use papa jan, khala jan, whatever terms of relationships, yeah? So I'm sure by the next generation after us will keep making changes. Just as a literary canon is not fixed and frozen in time, I don't think translations can be. They will evolve. People will take, not liberties, but will be more adventurous, will be more open to newer ways of doing things.
Yeah, just holding on to versionality as a key word here. Sometimes it's a great pleasure in reading 3 different translations of a text. And it's the delight of really following through on the choices, seeing where there's another journey of meaning that comes about through specific word choices. Yeah, so, and we're all aware, I mean, translations are for a generation, probably. They will be succeeded. And it's good to see this as a kind of like a gharana, if you will.
And to expand on this, there's a wonderful website called A Desert Full of Roses, maintained by Francis Pritchett. Good, bad, indifferent, patchy, uneven, every translation of almost every sher of every ghazal of Ghalib is to be found there. So from a K.C. Kanda to a whatever, you can see the generational changes, how older translators are doing it and how younger ones are doing it. You can see, so you can pick and choose, you know, you can say, okay, now this, because the Roman is given, the Urdu is given, the Devanagari is given, so you can pick and choose and say, okay, now I kind of like this, and this translation works for me. So this is one example, but it's very interesting to see how the same sher, those 2 lines, are translated in a variety of ways.
You know, I never thought I would read a footnote in a public context, but I'm going to read a footnote to one of my poems.
This is an evening dedicated to footnotes.
Absolutely. It goes like this. This is to a poem called Ape, which I'll read afterwards. The footnote goes like this. The lines attributed to Ghalib here are adapted from the first verse of Ghazal 17 from his Divan. Bas ki dushwar hai har kaam ka aasan hona, aadmi ko bhi muyassar nahi insaan hona. I translate this as, really, it's difficult to get something simple done. It isn't easy for a man to become a proper human being. See Francis W. Pritchett's superb site, A Desert Full of Roses, etc., etc. And the poem goes like this. Ape. The key body part can be downloaded on demand. Tear the banner, don the shroud. Try making a man, Ghalib says out loud. Let him walk blindfold on a gunpowder track that snakes through a crowd. One last suture to get this buttonholed skin in shape. Try making a man of the speaking ape.
I think that's a perfect note to end the evening.
Thank you, Rakshanda and Ranjit, for this beautiful conversation, very riveting. I have a feeling we could have gone on, but because of the other shows starting in the nursery, as you can now hear, we are sorry that we have to end it here. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight And the video of this session will be up on our YouTube channel, a Suitable Agency's YouTube channel and social media. And we'll be back on the 25th of November with the next episode of Suitable Conversations. So thank you, see you soon, and both the writers are here in case you have any further questions or you want to get your copy signed. And thank you so much for coming.